Hello, this is Abraham from EasyAutoDiagnostics.com. In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to test the ignition coil on the 1999 through 2001 2.0 Honda CR-V. To test the ignition coil, you're going to need a dedicated spark tester. The spark tester that I'm using is an HEI spark tester. Now, if you don't have a spark tester, at the end of the video, I'll tell you more about the one that I'm using and where you can buy it. You can also check the links in the video description below. When the ignition coil fails, the engine is not going to start, and none of the 4 spark plug wires will spark. So it's super important that you first test all 4 spark plug wires for spark. If even just one spark plug wire sparks, then you can conclude that the ignition coil is okay. To get this pot boiling, the first thing that I'm going to do is to disconnect the battery negative cable from the battery negative post. Since the ignition coil is inside the distributor, I need to remove the air filter assembly to gain access to it. And to remove it, I need to loosen the intake air duct hose clamp, and then remove the 2 bolts that hold the air filter box to the strut tower. I'm using a 5.5mm 1/4" socket on my drill to loosen the intake air duct hose clamp, but you can also use a Phillips head screwdriver. Now that I have the intake air duct hose clamp loosened, I'm removing the 2 10mm bolts that hold the air filter box to the strut tower. I can now remove the air filter assembly in one go. Okay, I'm removing the distributor cap to access the ignition coil by loosening the 3 8mm bolts that hold the cap to the distributor assembly. Now that I have access to the ignition coil, I'm going to test it for spark with my spark tester. Since I disconnected the battery at the beginning, I'm reconnecting the battery negative cable to the battery negative post. I'm placing the spark tester on the ignition coil tower with a battery jumpstart cable. I've got the other end of the battery jumpstart cable connected to the battery negative post. Now I'm having my helper crank the engine, and as you can see and hear, I've got spark. Since I've got spark, I can conclude that the ignition coil is good and working perfectly. I can conclude that the ignition control module is good and working correctly. I can also conclude that the distributor cap is defective. I'll say it again. I can conclude that the distributor cap is defective only if all 4 spark plug wires are not sparking. But spark is present at the ignition coil tower. Now, if the ignition coil does not spark, then my next step is to make sure that it's getting power. To verify that the ignition coil is getting power, I'm going to remove the distributor rotor so that I can then remove the plastic dust cap that covers the ignition coil. Once these components are out of the way, I can then access the ignition coil's power terminal. As a safety precaution, I'm disconnecting the battery before removing these components. I'm turning the engine by hand so that I can turn the rotor and have it pointing towards the radiator. Once the rotor is pointing towards the radiator, I'll be able to remove the Phillips head screw that holds the rotor to the distributor shaft. To turn the engine, I'm using a 19mm wrench to turn the power steering pump pulley. Since I don't want to loosen the pulley bolt, I'm turning the pulley towards the back of the Honda CR-V. I'm placing a shop towel underneath the distributor so that it'll catch the distributor rotor screw in case it falls out of my hand. Now that I've got the distributor rotor screw off, I'm removing the shop towel, I'm removing the distributor rotor and the dust cap. Since I disconnected the battery to remove the distributor rotor and dust cap, I'm now reconnecting it back to test for power. I'm placing my multimeter in volts DC mode, and I'm grounding the black multimeter test lead on the battery negative post. I'm having my helper turn the key on, and I'm connecting the red multimeter test lead to the ignition coil's power terminal. The multimeter should read between 10 to 12 volts DC with the key on. Now, if my multimeter would have read 0 volts, I would check fuse number 9 of the dash fuse box to see if it's blown. And if it is blown, I would have replaced it and checked for power once again. Okay, now that I've made sure that the ignition coil is getting power, I'm now going to make sure that the ignition control module is activating the ignition coil. This is a very simple test that's done with a 12-volt test light. To get started, I'm connecting the alligator clip of the test light to the battery positive terminal. Now I'm probing the signal terminal of the ignition coil with the test light. I'm going to hold it in place while my helper cranks the engine. The test light should flash on and off while the engine is cranking. If the test light flashes on and off, then I can conclude that the ignition coil is getting its activation signal and that the ignition control module is good. This test result lets me know that the ignition coil is defective only if the ignition coil did not spark in test 1 and it is getting power in test 2. I'll say it again. I can conclude that the ignition coil is defective only if the ignition coil is not sparking and it is getting 12 volts and it is getting its activation signal. Now, if the test light does not flash on and off, then I can conclude that either the ignition control module is defective or one of the crankshaft position sensors within the distributor is defective. Hey, thanks for watching, and if this video was helpful, give it a like. I'll be uploading short and to-the-point video tutorials on a regular basis that'll save you time and money, so be sure and subscribe to my channel. Be sure and visit my website and download and print my free ignition coil troubleshooting guide. You'll find a ton of information and more tutorials there too. The links are in the video description below. Now, if you've been wondering about the spark tester that I'm using, it is the OTC 6589 electronic ignition spark tester. I've been using an HEI spark tester for close to 30 years, and I can tell you from personal experience that it's the most accurate spark tester around. I don't trust any other spark tester when I'm diagnosing an ignition system. Now, there are 3 things that I love about this tool. Number 1, it's very accurate. If it sparks, the component in question is good. If it doesn't spark, the component in question is bad. You don't have to interpret the color of the spark. Number 2, it doesn't cost an arm and a leg. Number 3, I can use the HEI spark tester on any type of ignition system. To buy one, you can find the link in the video description below.